Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends. Hey, welcome to Life Support. So glad you're with us today. What we do on this program is we tell stories to help you find a deeper relationship with Christ. And we do it through talking about suffering, trauma, trials, difficulties, challenges, all of those things where Jesus shows up. And he does show up when you need him. And so I'm really thrilled to be joined by a guest today who I just have a ton of respect for, who's the Executive Director of Church Planning for Great Lakes region of Converge. His name is Glen Herschberger. And Glen, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Pastor Paul.
All right, so you're in Wisconsin right now, correct?
That is correct.
And you're kind of near the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin. So are you in Packer country or are you in Viking country there?
Well, I tell you what, it's a mixed bag where I live. We have a lot of Minnesota fans on this side of St. Croix, but I was raised in Wisconsin, so it's kind of by default, I have to be a Packer fan.
So you're on the Packer end of things, but when you're speaking in Minnesota, you got to tuck that away. It doesn't always go over very well here.
I'm very stealth.
Good, because God might, how Paul always prayed to have that thorn taken away. I've got Packer fans on staff here. And it's a constant problem when I come to work. So
it sounds like a blessing, actually.
All right, now here's the thing about Glen Herschberger that I find fascinating is that you haven't always been a church planting guy. You have a whole career before that. Why don't you just take us back to, just give us a quick recap of your story and what you did before you became the Executive Church Planning Director.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story. Got into law enforcement, worked at a sheriff's department in Green Lake, Wisconsin for a few years, then went to Fond du Lac City. And then I thought I was done with law enforcement, had a good career, total with even part-time, 24 years. And when I went to Lake Mills, Wisconsin to plant a church, my old chief deputy hired me part-time, which aided the church plant tremendously. People trust law enforcement for the most part. And I got into the schools teaching kids DARE and so forth. And it was, did that for about 8 years. And then God called us to Panama. Actually, I was in the church plant for 11 years. Then God called us to plant a church in Panama City, Panama, targeting or reaching out to the expatriates that spoke English. And so we were there for 4 years, got the church up and running, LifeBridge International Church. It's a wonderful, wonderful ministry. And then Converge hired us as directors of mobilization, and we worked in Orlando in the Converge office for about 3 years.
All right, so tell me what it's like to be a believer in Jesus Christ in the law enforcement community.
Yeah, I've shared with a lot of people that faith and grounding sustain me. Because Scripture clearly talks about the depraved and the sinfulness of our culture. When you work in law enforcement, you do see the underbelly of the culture. And I worked many years for a night shift. And I just had this conversation with someone recently that nothing good happens after midnight. There's a lot of darkness, and it's not just because the sun set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good thing to tell our kids. I don't think they believe us when we tell them that, but
no, they don't.
But here's the thing. I got to, Wendy and I were kind of exposed to that community from the other side as a family, a victim of a homicide. And so we all of a sudden became well acquainted with a team of detectives and how this kind of whole process worked. And they would, as we got to know them, they would begin to open up about these kinds of things, about what they saw and their frustrations and things like that. And I just want to say, before we go any further with that, is, law enforcement is under siege right now, and our experience with these guys was amazing. They were professional. They cared about what they were doing. They went beyond the pale to help us out. But they would, they started to open up. It's really rough out there, isn't it? I mean, the stuff you see. Did that conflict with the worldview that you had when you first started? That this really isn't what the world's like? And, oh no, like it really is like this.
Yeah, well, when you're 21 years old, as many of us know, you think you know a lot, but you really don't know anything. And I was pretty optimistic. And I always tell the story. I wasn't smart enough to go become a doctor or, a physician of some sort. And I wanted to help people. That was the driving force, to really help and serve people. Well, you get in maybe a couple hours, a couple days, and you realize really quickly that people don't want your help. And so that was a tension that you live with, because you really do have the motivation. Most of us that get into this career really want to help people. And some people will receive it and others reject it. And, you see this suffering that's caused by their poor decisions. And there's nothing that we in law enforcement can do. We can just respond. And so that probably was the most frustrating thing. And then you get jaded. So when I work night shift, you get lied to, you get spit at, you get cussed at, and you're like, you're kidding me. I'm just trying to help you. And that may mean actually arresting them. And I've had people that I've arrested that actually, when they got out of jail, they thanked me because it was a wake-up call for them. But yeah, it's tough out there currently. It's unprecedented. We haven't seen this in a long time in our culture, and it's pretty bleak.
Yeah, tell me about that. I wanted to get there next. What do you see happening right now? What, in your mind, is the most difficult thing to be watching happening in our culture right now regarding how law enforcement is being seen and so forth?
I think it's the narrative that you watch or you read in the news that isn't really truly reflective of our culture. I read a Gallup poll back in May that said of the professions, our culture really still trusts law enforcement. It's like 56, 57%. I might add that only 8% trust our senators. So, just keep that in mind. I think there's this feeling in law enforcement that they're not supported. They're very, the culture is suspicious of them. You can't do anything without a camera, smartphone videotaping, what you're trying to do. And that 30-second video isn't always representative of what's really happening in that case. So I think you have that. I know a number of officers that I'm connected with. They're like, you know what? I've got the time in. I'm going to retire. It's just not worth it. And then the assassinations, the killings towards law enforcement, it's alarming. It's really alarming. So it's very discouraging right now in the law enforcement community.
Where do you see all this heading? In other words, 10 years from now, are we going to have any new police officers? I mean, sometimes my kids will be watching commercials for, say, the Minnesota State Highway Patrol. They're recruiting, and they'll say, "Hey, I'd like to do that." And one son will look, "You don't make enough money, do you, Dad, to put yourself through that?" Are we going to have any police officers if this continues? Because I can't imagine very many young people really thinking this is a worthwhile trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, from the agencies that I'm connected to, recruitment is down certainly, but I'm an optimistic. I think we'll weather this. This is a noble profession. This is an honorable profession. I would say 99% of the officers out there are good people that want to help people. Yes, you have bad apples in every bunch in every walks of life. Unfortunately, we're the front line of government. And so we're the protectors, we're the guardians. And people in our culture in America, we don't like being told what to do. So don't infringe on my rights. And when I cross that line, there's consequences. So I do think, it's the narrative that can be played out. And I do think we can overcome this. I really think we can overcome it.
As a believer in Jesus Christ, and a lot of people listening to this and watching this right now are believers in Christ, can you give us some counsel? How are we to see this dilemma? We want to support law enforcement, but I'm well aware of the fact that I'm white. I grew up in a white community. I've never walked in the feet, the shoes of an African American or a person of color. I don't know what it's like. How do I kind of figure out what to believe and where to go with this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Why don't you frame that in a different way? What do you mean by where do we go with this?
What am I supposed to think as a follower of Christ? Who am I supposed to support? What should my mind frame be around all of this, because it's easy, like you said, it's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to choose sides. It's easy to choose a villain and a hero, or discount one community completely. And I think that's a struggle for a lot of people, because as I watch all of the narrative in front of me, the political narrative and this whole law enforcement thing, unfortunately, has become a political football now. You can't be in the middle anymore. You can't say, well, hey, that's a good point. That's a good point. It's like, no, you're either good or bad. And I'm not sure that a Jesus follower should take that tact. I mean, if anybody should be open to justice and the oppressed and thinking this through, it's us, I would think. What do you think?
Yeah, I do agree with that. And this is not the first time our culture has gone through a reset in law enforcement. It happened in the 20s, the turn of the century, certainly in the 60s, and most recent times and 70s. There's always been this proactive reform in reaction. And so standards have been increased. I had a lot of training in my 24 years. Like, we are highly trained individuals, and whether it's at the range, whether it's physical altercations, but I think the law enforcement community, I was under the era where community-based policing was really the emphasis. This is maybe prior to Columbine shooting out in Colorado. I was in the schools serving, and so it really was about developing relationships. And so how can we truly understand if we don't take the time to listen and talk to the people that we're charged to protect and serve? So, to answer your question, I'm not going to take a political side in law enforcement. I'm on the side of law and order. I'm on the side of the policies that I fall under in the police department. So I'll give you an example. When I got hired in Fond du Lac, I'm reading the policy that was part of my training. And back then, in 1988, they had a policy that you could fire a warning shot in the air. And you're like, okay, well, that bullet's going to come down somewhere. So I thought, okay, that is a policy that has to be changed. So there's constant rewriting, adjusting. You see that in high-speed chases. You see that in stop and frisk situations. And so I think it's always an ongoing reform within law enforcement, because we're so visible representing the government that we're charged to serve.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, this thing called a cell phone has really changed everything, hasn't it? I mean, everything now is on video. Yeah. And you see something on TV and you really make a decision, guilty, innocent, before a trial. And I would assume, from an officer's perspective, to intervene with all these people filming you would be terrifying. Like, what if I say the wrong thing? What if that gets perceived that way or that way? And I would think that would be very difficult to do your job.
Well, and the thing is, it is difficult, but law enforcement should help themselves. They should be very keenly aware that someone is watching, not that they never weren't watching, but now it's being recorded. And like I said earlier, that 30-second snippet may not do justice of the true actual reality of that incident. Yeah, I think we've got to get better at trying to diffuse situations. I'm not a big guy, but I'm not a little guy. I never wanted to get in a fight, so I could use my words to diffuse situations and not escalate. But you're emotionally charged. I've been on a number of high-speed chases in my career. I've been on probably 6 shoot, don't shoot situations. I never had to shoot anyone. I've had my weapon, pulled. And what the public doesn't realize, that it's like 95% of all law enforcement never even pulled their service weapon in their whole career. But the big cities, obviously, that's a different statistic. And we have to write reports, Pastor, that it details everything. And we have to keep records for the federal government, the state government. And so there is documentation of what's really going on that you don't always see in the news.
Yeah, and that sounds like the funnest part of the job, is sitting there writing reports all of the time. Now, how did you make this change from a law enforcement officer to a church planter? And then you kind of mixed them up for a little while there, but maybe that was part of God's transition in your life. Why that transition?
It's interesting. I so value the local church, and people need to serve in the local church to discover what is their calling, what is their giftedness. And so I just tell a lot of our churches that I serve in our district, you need to find out their spiritual giftedness, their passions, what really ignites their energy and their enthusiasm to serve the local church. So I started a men's ministry right around the time Promise Keepers was starting. I was pretty evangelistic at the police department. I actually did start a police chaplaincy, and that's another whole story we could share some other time. But I don't want to see anyone go to hell. And I think we've got a calling to be evangelists and to share the good news of Christ to whoever. And so it just happened to be in law enforcement. But then I got this call, like I sensed this holy discontentment. Like, is there something else, Lord, that you want me to do? And sure enough, I didn't see it coming. We had been taking our church in Lake Mills to Ecuador on short-term mission trips. And so I kind of got a sense that maybe God was going to send me to Ecuador, but it was Panama. When I was leaving Fond du Lac to start a church, it was with the sole reason to reach a community that didn't have an evangelical, gospel-centered church. So you got to go back on the calling. Not everybody's called into law enforcement or ministry as a pastor, but I do believe everyone's called to do something for God.
And you listened to that calling and you moved forward. Now, how hard of a decision, how difficult was that to leave what you knew behind and venture out into this sort of new territory?
Well, what I love about Converge is you go through an assessment and then you have a coach. If I had to figure this out on my own, there's no way I could have done it. I would have crashed and burned. So that's part of it. It's the systems, the coverings, the organization that you're with. I think that's a big part of it. Never felt that I was doing this alone. So we had sending churches that supported us. And then my wife of 37 years this year, she was supportive. But if my wife said, no, we're not doing that, I would have listened to that. Because I saw in law enforcement, Pastor, I saw in law enforcement, if the spouse was not supported, the officer would quit. I see that in ministry. If the spouse isn't supported, the pastor's not going to last.
Yeah, the unspoken heroes are the pastor's wives. I mean, they have to provide emotional support. Everyone in the church thinks they know everything about what's happening in the church when many times we don't tell them very much because we want them to actually have a joyful experience in church. And if they knew all the problems, they wouldn't. And it's a very, very difficult role. And that's really a good insight. Yeah, pray for your pastor's wife, and leave her alone. I mean, encourage her and be her friend, and don't talk to her about church all the time, because I think she probably wants to talk about some other things. Right. So here you are now. You're becoming a church planter, and you got this in your veins now. And by the way, Converge. When we talk about Converge, it's a denomination, I guess. It's a movement of churches around the country. Many would remember it as the Baptist General Conference. That's what we're talking about. And now you're kind of taking this love of both of these areas, and you're working on a really interesting project. Tell me about it.
Yeah, well, I think it started when I was working in Lake Mills. I got hired part-time, and I'm working in a small little department of 11 officers. But the spiritual conversations that I would have. And then I believe it was 5 of the officers had visited the church. I baptized 4 of them. And then 3 of them got really connected to the church, the new church plant. And so I saw something, like there is an openness. And so that was planted back in, 2000, 2002. And then in 2016, I heard about a church in Chattanooga called Cop Church of Chattanooga. And then there's a Cop Church of Idaho Falls. And so it planted this seed. Now, when you're a retired law enforcement, I have, I'm an extrovert, so I don't have a problem talking to people, but I would go up to any cop and I'd give them a hard time. And they kind of look at me and they say, hey, I'm retired from Green Lake or from Fond du Lac or wherever. And then there's an openness. There's, hey, there's a brotherhood. You've walked in our shoes. We accept you. And so it planted this seed 5 years ago, and I've been praying, Lord, if you want me to do something like this, I'm gonna I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to respond to that. So we're in the works of launching Cities Cop Church sometime in early October. We're making some headway, good contacts, good good involvement from law enforcement. But it's not just law enforcement, it's first responders, it's EMS, it's fire, it's dispatchers, it's clerical, and anyone can attend, but it's the niche. It's the niche, kind of like Cowboy Church, if you've heard of Cowboy Church.
Yeah.
We have one up in Ham Lake, I believe, or Biker Church. We have one of those in our district, so guys that love Harleys, they have a motorcycle blessing, and it's tuned to that audience.
Sure.
But everyone's welcome. And so that's what we're working on currently.
And what's one thing that we can be praying about, Glenn, as you get ready to launch this thing?
Yeah, it really is about reaching men and women that have a faith. Maybe they've kind of given up on the church. And then I do believe there's some that don't have a faith that need to be introduced to the true Jesus, not to the false gospel that's floating around out there. So I would say praying specifically that we would do a very good job servicing these men and women and families, because I do think the families are going to find their way to this new ministry. We're going to support them. We're going to support them well. And that I think pray for that. And then I think praying for our team, that God would continue to build a team that can do the job to get this launched.
And of course, there's always financial concerns too. If somebody would like to make a donation, how would they go about doing that, Glenn?
Well, our website will be online tomorrow. So we've done all the necessary work to get it, nonprofit status with the state of Minnesota. Our website will be up tomorrow. We have a giving platform. So yeah, we do have needs. And the amazing thing is this, I just got to tell you this quick story. I really haven't even asked people to give, and people are giving, because they know this is a very good cause and a very timely need in our culture today. So a lady, husband and wife that we met in Panama, are now in Georgia, and we sent out our newsletter this weekend, and she texted us, say, hey, I just want you to know we want to give you our tithe this month. And so they gave us a generous donation, and we're like, okay, Lord, that's the beauty of the body of Christ. There's no other organization like that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it's City Cops Church. Just Google that. You'll find it, and you can pray. And all right. Glenn, thanks so much for being here. We've just scratched the surface. There's so many other questions I have for you. We can do that next time, but thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it very much.